Richard, you had a bit shorter presentation than expected, so I think you have more to say about proposals.
Okay, so let me. It's true I was a bit rushed, but I wasn't sure whether it was too long or too short. But in any case, it's good to have a little bit of time to hold on a second here. To reflect, but I think what I'm going to do is stress the things that I had to rush through at the end. That so, what's unique about the approach that we're suggesting? And I think many of us will have read documents written in Canada, written in Brussels, written in Bern in Switzerland, for example, written in Tokyo. Actually, I didn't read the ones in Tokyo because those are probably in Japanese, where people are looking to Biden as music to your ears, an opportunity, and thinking about what priorities each and every country should first ask the Biden administration to do. And our argument was that this natural, inevitable bilateral reflection by the foreign policy think tanks, by the economic think tanks, and by the trade policy world inside each country, that's natural and instinctive to go bilateral. But I think on this particular president, in this particular setting, those will actually be harmful and not progress. This is not a matter of the new Japanese prime minister playing golf with the new US president as a way of making sure that Japan's concerns are heard at the table. I think what the Biden administration would really like to do is just pretend trade didn't exist for the first 4 years, at least for the first 2 years. And that's what Obama did. The Biden administration was elected by a coalition of Democrats who have very different views. Different parts of the Democratic Party have very different views on trade. And in general, it's not a good day to be pro-trade. So I think Biden's administration will try and put off or delay or fob off everybody who comes to them with concerns. And they understand they have to do a few things. Now, if instead a group of people, a group of countries get together and start to work with the US, and the US gets back in the habit of thinking that working together with other countries, including on trade, is a way of advancing their policy goals, highest level policy goals possible, that will get a different echo in the Oval Office. And that's really how it has to go. It has to go straight up to the Oval Office in order to get anything done very, very soon. On a more practical level, it's also probably true that the Biden trade policy appointees won't be approved very quickly because it is exactly so conflictual. Now, the USTR designate is likely not to run into too much problems, but even with Lighthizer, for example, it was delayed until summer before he was appointed, and they didn't really start doing anything until the beginning of the 2017. So that's the first thing, and this idea that now there's a number of groups. There's been the trilateral between U.S. Japan and EU thinking about subsidies. There's been the Ottawa group thinking about WTO reforms. There's all sorts of groups. And it's that kind of idea, pulling in Biden administration foreign policy folks and talking to them about how trade can be a flanking policy that helps them advance that. That mindset is quite different and will probably require many people to break out of the silos that we all have in our governments, that trade is something and trade sort of advances independent of these and should be isolated or insulated from other things. I think we have to get into the mindset where in the years going forward, trade will be the flanking policy to other policies, not the other way around. Now, the second point, which I had to rush on, but Andre stressed it, is that this is in no way anti-China. And we in the group, we were worried continuously as being seen that this was somehow ganging up on China. And I want to take a time to sort of address that head on and lay out what is the world we live in now? What are the prospects of China getting back into a situation where it was before Trump caused all these troubles? So we have to think about what is the baseline right now for China and what could be the baseline if we get back to cooperation, and how what we're talking about plays into that transition. So Trump really destroyed the feeling, the atmosphere. The mood music was hostile, distrustful, explicitly anti-multilateral, and on occasion explicitly insulting to many countries, including China. He was creating discord, and this is the way, if you read his book, creating discord, creating discomfort, creates opportunities for him to then seize and move forward. That was his view. Now, this is not the way an open rules-based system works. It's not the way the US has run this system since World War II. It's been predictable. It's been slow. It's been very diplomatic. People have been very nice about things. Now, this toxic environment, which does exist right now, and it started to, the toxicity tends to spread. When people get nasty, lots of people get nasty. This toxic atmosphere stands in the way of adapting economic cooperation to the realities of today. And make no mistake, they have to be adapted. There's not only no going back to the Obama administration, there's also no going back to the world where Doha and advancing the trade facilitation, where that was really what cooperation was about. There are some fundamental changes that have to happen in the system in order to get the different types of capitalism to work together in a trading system that's mutually advantaged for all of us. And China is going to be part of that reality. Now, just to hasten to say that nobody has benefited more in the last 20 or 30 years from the multilateral trading system that is open and rules-based than China. So China has an enormous stake in restoring trust and cooperation. And as I mentioned very briefly, that there's a strong echo between the conflict between US and Japan back in the 80s and US and China now. So there was allegations that it was a very different system of government, and people in 1980s like Lester Thoreau would write about the Keiretsu and Japan incorporated with the government, the banks, and the corporations were all working together in order to advance Japanese industrial interests. The idea that METI, for instance, was very interventionist, but also the Ministry of Finance with allocating foreign exchange or credits with the goal of encouraging manufacturing and exports in particular. Those were almost unfair, learning from foreigners. Almost all the allegations that are being made against China right now were made against Japan then. But things found a way to live together and move forward. And I think I'm very hopeful that the same will happen. But the US has to be in a spirit where they wanted it to go forward. I was in the Bush administration when the structural impediments initiatives were working, and this was the Bush senior administration. He very, very much disagreed with the idea of Japan bashing and bilateral problems. He viewed it in a bigger geostrategic setting where Japan was an ally, and it was important to settle these trade frictions and to get back to the cooperation. So getting the US back in the multilateral game is the necessary condition, the sine qua non of solving the problem and removing the distrust, hostility, and acrimony created by Trump. So this is a step that will have to happen. And it seems very clear that it will not happen quickly if this is a worldwide convening of all the problems who have all their problems, and we start talking with the United States. It's important to get a snow going where the US gets back into the instinct of turning multilateral, turning to economic cooperation, both as a carrot and as a lever to advance US interest in and also advance multilateral cooperation. So finding a solution to the interface problem, which is something we will have to do, and hopefully in the next 4 years will do, the first step is getting the US back in the game. And we believe that this working together using trade tracks is the way to get back in. So it's not anti-China, actually creating a framework in which China can participate and will have to participate in reshaping the rules to allow state-led capitalism and market-led capitalism to work together in a set of rules and a trading system that's good for everybody. So I think I will stop right there. Of course, I could go on and on and on about particular WTO reforms and stuff, but I think it's best if I just stop there. And maybe Andre has a bunch of stuff to do. I know Andre is very keen on WTO reform, and we kind of skipped over it. So I don't know if that's, I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Richard. Andre, do you have any comment on the WTO reform?
Right. Yes, I do actually. So I have two points to make. Obviously, one of the great irritants has been the demise of the appellate body, and I think that needs to be a priority. And I don't think it's not a trivial priority for I think two reasons. I think that there are two things to avoid here. With the Trump administration, it's clear that what they wanted is to go back to the GATT situation. So to have a dispute settlement, but to have a dispute settlement that was in the end purely diplomatic, right? There would be the panels, and then they would not be sort of the judicial element, the appellate body, and the situation would be dealt with, the dispute would be dealt with eventually in a diplomatic manner. Okay, so I think the Trump administration was not against dispute settlement; it was against dispute settlement a la WTO, the appellate body. So I think that solution is not an acceptable situation for most countries, and certainly not for the European Union. The European Union is insisting that we do need a judicial element. So we do need the appellate body to be back in business. At the same time, I think there is room, and this is, I think, what the negotiations to be about, and that the European Union did not succeed to have in a constructive manner with the United States and with others as to what kind of reform of the appellate body in order to maintain the judicial element, but remove some of the irritants that some of the US administration, not only Trump, but that was already the case with Obama, felt about the system. And I think that has to relate to the second leg, which is the legislative function of the WTO. I think one cannot look at those two functions, the judicial function of the WTO, the appellate body, independently from the legislative function, from the rule making. The WTO has had difficulties. Before Trump came, the WTO was working fairly well. Now there, I don't quite agree on that. And yes, people were sitting around the table, but they were not sitting around the table being able to come up with modernizing the rules. So the modernization of the rules, the legislative function of the WTO was in difficulty. And because that legislative function was broken, then from the judicial side, they filled the space. Somebody needed to fill the space. There were disputes there. The rules were not satisfactory. And then the judges need to interpret the rules. And then there was dissatisfaction on the part of some members, including the United States, that there was too much judicial activism. But that judicial activism on the part of the appellate body was the reflection of the fact that there was too little legislative activism. So I think one has to see the two as being complements to one another, not as substitutes. So the reform is both a reform on some of the rules, and I think one can discuss which are the rules, and there are negotiations ongoing on e-commerce, on digital trade, and that's extremely important. One needs also rules probably about climate issues, including border adjustment measures. They are the issues indeed, I think the crucial ones that Richard talked about how to have a WTO system that is compatible with a diversity of economic models, sort of the more capitalist, market capitalism and more state capitalism. I think this is really a huge matter. And then I think probably there needs to be some adjustment, not to the spirit, but to some of the functioning of the appellate body to avoid some excesses probably that occurred during the last 25, 30 years at the WTO. So I think this is the spirit, but I very much insist that modernizing the rules and the judicial function, the appellate body, those two should be viewed ultimately as a package. The two work together. If one function does not work well, then the other one is also under tremendous stress. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Andre. Reform in the judicial function and rule-making function in the WTO both are necessary. That's the perspective. I understand. Thank you very much for your comment. We are getting a question from the audience. First question is maybe Richard. What's your opinion about trade restriction for the reason of economic national security? I mean, the high-tech trade on high-tech technology issues.
So I think I would put two separate baskets. So one is the national security tariffs, which we've discussed already. Those will the Biden administration will have to come up with a plan of removing those one way or another. And the solution to removing them may not just be unilateral removing of American tariffs and unilateral removing of the retaliation. It may be more complicated than that. I was talking on a webinar with Chad Bowen, the trade expert in Washington, and he was simply pointing out that steel is a sensitive product in the US now, just as rice is a sensitive product in Japan, and cheese is a sensitive product in EU, and softwood is a sensitive product in Canada. So it may end up being that the plan to remove these tariffs involves a broader agreement on things such as supply restrictions. The second thing is, during the campaign, this is my personal interpretation, and I haven't discussed it with the group, so don't think it's on the group, and it's nothing in the document. My personal opinion was that Trump's idea was to create lots of problems and then strike a bilateral deal man to man. And I think that's what he did with China. He created all sorts of fear and uncertainty. And then he did a really kind of low quality managed trade deal, which wasn't enforceable, wasn't realistic, but made it look like on Twitter that he had a win. And that plan was not working very well. And the Democrats could have blindsided him as saying that he was weak on China. Could very easily be said during the election that Trump signed this deal. It was all about bilateral trade, but because of the asynchronous recoveries of the economy, actually the trade deficit between the US and China was going the wrong way, and the managed trade targets were not being met. So in my view, a lot of what Trump did in the last few months was ramping up the rhetoric, attacking China in all sorts of ways where he could unilaterally, as president, have the power to cause disruptions and look anti-Chinese and being really disruptive. And I think that's where all those trade, the technology things came. Now, whether those go away, I'm not sure, because one thing that Trump has done is he's broken the rule of silence. Inside the United States, there was this kind of law of silence where politicians weren't talking about Chinese practices on tech transfer or Chinese policies on developing high-tech industries, because most of the American companies were making lots of money in China and had presence in China. So nobody really wanted to talk about it. And what Trump did was break that convention, and now everybody's talking about it. So this idea that China's rise in high-tech industries has much more of a bipartisan basis. Now, what was wrong with, what was very frequently wrong with Trump was not only was it intellectually incoherent, but it was tactically incompetent. And a lot of these things that he's done on trade, even if there was a particular US plan to in the worst case, try and stifle China's rise as a tech power, it wasn't very technically competent. So it needs to be rethought. So I think the Biden administration will be open to rethinking these and maybe recrafting them. But I don't think there's an appetite to just like, okay, now we go back and hope, that Huawei and ZTE and all these companies are going to be our friends, just like Google and Amazon are, or frenemies anyways. I think it will be difficult to remove those, but maybe a process of reflection and a more systematic reflection on how to do this. For instance, the process that the US used on South Africa to change the apartheid regime. That was a very systematic, very well thought through thing. The system that the US used to confront the Soviet Union on technology, export controls, that was a very well thought through technocratic thing with a whole office looking at what's going on. It may go back to something like that, but I don't think these attacks on individual Chinese technology companies is going to be reversed quickly. That's just my humble opinion of reading the newspapers and reading between the lines. So I don't know if that, I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Richard. The second question is to Andre. Since the Chinese influence and economic power is growing quite rapidly, and so what is the perspective from the Europe to address Chinese issues? And do you have any advice to the Japanese? That's a question from the audience.
I don't have advice to Japan. I can say what Europe is doing. Number one, I think Europe published last year a document, a position on our relation with China, and I think which is sort of a realistic approach, where we viewed China as a partner on some issue and as a rival on other matters. So and that has all kinds of implications, political implications certainly, but also economic implications. At the moment, the concrete element of our discussion with China is still around a bilateral investment treaty. I think for Europe, it is a huge priority. We have been engaged now for 5-10 years into such a negotiation, and it has proved quite difficult. There are lots of sticking points, both about EU investment in China and the treatment of EU investment in China, and also about now the treatment of Chinese investment in the EU. So on both sides, there are a number of discussions. But I do believe that if we can make progress on this issue, which does address some of the state capitalism features of the Chinese system that we discussed before, if we can solve that in the context of the investment treaty, then I think we will be in good standing to be able to approach some of the WTO issues that relate to China in a multilateral framework in a much better way. I suppose that the US, which has a similar process of discussion with China on a bilateral investment treaty, I think that agreement will also be made. I don't know what is the situation in Japan, frankly. So I don't know whether Japan is also engaged in a similar process with China on an investment treaty, and therefore whether there would be for Japan some if not lessons, at least something to learn from both the process and from the outcome, if that outcome were to be positive soon with China.
Thank you, Andre. We very much look for the outcome of the bilateral negotiation on investment between Europe and China. And for Japan, we had earlier trilateral investment treaty among Japan and China and Korea, just for your reference. And I have a question from the audience, maybe to Richard or Andre. The question is, President Trump broke the WTO but struck bilateral trade deals. Even the difficulty of restoring the WTO, even under the Biden, could we restore the global trading order based on the bilateral deals? That's a question from the audience. Richard, what's your reaction?
So the question is, could the world trading system be based on bilateral deals? And the answer is no. I mean, a lot of progress has happened since the Doha round was launched, and a huge amount of liberalization and rule writing has been done regionally, but that's not a system. And that was often dealing with things other than trade. So it was dealing with services, intellectual property rights, capital, short-term movement of people that was necessary for global value chains. And those were more naturally in a bilateral kind of setting. But even there was emerging at least 10, 15 years ago, the feeling that this noodle bowl and this spaghetti bowl was not the right way forward. And so the narrative before Trump was that they were getting knitted into mega regionals like TPP and TTIP, et cetera, so that it was going more towards multilateral and rounding them out. And so I think that is what, we might get back to that narrative if we can't restore the WTO's negotiating functions very quickly. We may get back to smoothing out the bilateralism into sort of more regional or mega regional or even global kind of agreements. Obviously, RCEP was a big step forward on this, but the thing it really did was harmonize rules of origin. It did some liberalization between China, Korea, and Japan, but a lot of it was harmonizing rules of origin and getting rid of the problems of bilateralism. So bilateralism is most definitely not a solution, especially the bilateralism as Trump viewed it, which was dirty little deals on lobsters with the EU, or buying a few tons of grain with China. That was not managed trade bilaterally, is most definitely not the way forward. And so we really do have to revitalize multilateralism.
Thank you, Richard. I think Andre has the same answer.
I very much have the same answer indeed. I'm a staunch supporter of the multilateral system. I do believe that in some instances, some of those bilateral or regional trade agreements are useful. In others, I think sometimes they've gone too far. I do recognize that in some of the non-trade issue of regulatory aspects, sort of the deep trade element, for instance, in services, I do recognize there that although we have an overarching agreement, the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, I do recognize that some of the progress, the substantial progress that can be done, can only be done among like-minded countries. It's hard to have a global agreement on certain regulatory aspects. So sure, on the EU-Japan agreement, one can go further, deeper in some dimensions that it's possible to do at the WTO, but at least we do have at the same time a global framework. So I think there it works well. I'm not keen on having bilateral agreements on trade issues that are not under already the orbit of the ambit of the WTO. So I want to give the emphasis to the multilateral rules, and then the regional as a complement in some dimensions, not the other way around. Definitely not as a substitute.
Thank you very much. Another question from the floor is, what's your assessment of the Biden's designation of Catherine Tai?
So I don't know her. Never heard of her before. I read about that in the newspaper, but everything I read about her and the reactions to people seems to be that it was very clever, that it ticks lots and lots of boxes, and it reflects to a certain extent. And I saw one of the questions in the chat, which you didn't ask, about the different parties. And I think it's important to realize that trade is not a partisan issue in the United States. Trump attitude towards nationalism is a partisan issue, although there's people on both sides of the aisle that have some elements of that. But in terms of the basics of trade, in terms of the attitude towards China, the attitude towards a worker-oriented, American-oriented trade policy, America first, buy America, those are broadly held partisan things. And I think she has the ability to kind of reflect that bipartisan consensus. And one thing I think which is very revealing, that according to what I read in the newspapers, I don't have any special intelligence, she was involved in the discussion of the reform of NAFTA, which eventually be called USMCA. And amazingly, the Democrats more or less went along with that Trumpian kind of view. There was some elements of it that seemed very managed trade, especially in autos. But a lot of the elements, the Democrats came along and were actually supporting it at the end. So that kind of idea, and apparently she was deeply involved in deals of that. And the fact that she was involved in that, I think, is giving you an idea of how partisanship in the United States will play out with trade, is that it's not going to be a bipartisan issue. And if it is, it's not going to happen, because that's not where Biden wants to spend any political capital pushing through. So in some sense, she is probably a very good both bellwether for the new reality in Washington, but also maybe a good person to deal with both the sort of labor and environment stuff, but also the China issue, which is very big. So I think it's a wise one. What will be interesting is to see whether the Republicans let it go through quickly, or whether they're going to start blocking everything. But I was encouraged by it.
Let me just add one point on this. I can say that it was very well received in Brussels. So it was received as was viewed as a very good choice for pushing forward the agenda of cooperation, both from a bilateral, but also definitely from a global perspective.
Thank you very much. Maybe the last question. This is a question from myself, and many people in Japan are interested if new administration in the US will come back to the TPP or CPTPP in the future. What's your prospects?
Let me take a quick bash. Not anytime soon. I think one thing that was very clear in Biden's campaign and some of his talking and some of the things that his advisors have been saying is that there's going to be no big trade deals that involve any liberalization of the US until the big domestic issues are settled, and those aren't going to be settled quickly. So the only possible way would be is if it was woven into a very large geostrategic, geoeconomic pivot to the Pacific, or way of dealing with the Chinese rivalry or whatever. But I don't think that is really a way forward. Whereas before, things like that, that was the old system where the instinct in Washington was to do a trade deal and use that as a way of advancing foreign policy goals. That was sort of the way it's been in the United States since the 60s, when trade was part of keeping together the anti-Soviet coalition. But I think that mood music has changed. And so trade agreements per se are a little bit toxic. And not that TPP, the US was negotiated it, so it's not a million miles away. But if you remember, if you go back, if Clinton had won, it wasn't absolutely sure that TPP would have won approval in US Congress. So it was controversial before Trump. So now I don't think it's the snapback way. That I think that will have to probably be a mistake to try and push it too hard. The only way to do it is to point out to the US that they're getting left behind, and that kind of don't want to be left behind might be encouraging for them to do something on it.
Thank you very much. Many issues we need to continue to discuss, and there are many remaining questions from the floor, but now it's time to close. Thank you very much for your contribution and participation, Richard and Andre. And thank you everyone for joining us. So now the session is closed. Thank you again, Richard and Andre.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye. Yes.